What up, people? My name is Shaggy, the Opinionated Hippie. I started this channel to review all things Frank Zappa, which I've almost done, like 80% there. But I've also expanded Frank Zappa's concept of the big note to include anything that I think would fall under Frank Zappa's concept of the big note. I've talked about that elsewhere. But Deep Purple, I would argue, is a big note Hall of Famer, mainly because they wrote a song about Frank Zappa and the Mothers, and some stupid with the flare gun who burned the place to the ground. And that song they wrote about Frank Zappa, you know, the lyrics inspired by Frank Zappa, is arguably the greatest hard rock song ever, and or arguably contains the greatest hard rock riff ever. So I think those two things are worthy of making Deep Purple big note worthy, if not big note Hall of Fame. But anyways, that's all beside the point. I'm ranking and reviewing their albums, 21 studio albums, not doing the live ones, not doing the most recent cover album. Not a big fan of cover albums. There are 21 of them, doing them by tiers. This is the B tier, and it starts with number 20 in the list. So if you do the math, you can figure out how many C tier albums I thought there were. I think there are. And really, the C tier album is the only one I kind of don't ever revisit ever in the Deep Purple catalog. And I think all the B tier albums are solidly B tier. I don't even think they're like hovering near B minus, on the verge of being like a C plus. They're solid B tier albums. Like, other than that one anomaly in their catalog, I think Deep Purple is remarkably consistent, and remarkably consistent in the way they sound, but also consistent in like how they slightly push the envelope but stay in like a hard rock lane, and how they're really just never bad. I mean, that C tier album was just kind of boring and, you know, nondescript and generic. But other than that, yeah, they're just a really, really good band. So anyways, yeah, that's it. I'm going to discuss their albums. Tell me what I get wrong. Tell me why these albums should be ranked higher or lower. I know you have opinions. I know the way this works. But anyways, yeah, on to number 20, the first of the B tier albums. Number 20, Rapture of the Deep. This came out in 2005. It is the fourth of the Steve Morse era albums, second of the Mark 8, Don Airey and Steve Morse era albums. And they've done, what, 7 thus far? 8 if you don't include the covers albums, I think is what it is. And this is the only one that I think is just doesn't have at least one really good standout track to like elevate it above the others or even to the same tier as the others. It's a solid album. It's your pretty much straightforward Deep Purple hard rock. Steve Morse is definitely flexing a lot more muscle and just seems more integrated into the band. And again, the grooves by Ian Pace and Roger Glover are ridiculous. Ian Gillan's vocals are, again, nothing is better. Don Airey is doing a very good job of like filling in for being John Lord, but still sounding kind of like himself. And Steve Morse, by this point, I'm bought into his sound. Took me a while to come around to his more shredding type sound. Can't say I was an immediate fan at first, but I've come around to his sound. But this album just doesn't have anything, I think, like a really strong track to maybe elevate it, other than just being like enjoyable, really reliable, just solid Deep Purple hard rock. Doing this in the 2000s when like the musical landscape is nowhere near where he is, at least if not like a retro sense, like a Wolf Mother or something like that, or even like a White Stripes, that kind of whatever that was. They're still just doing their thing, and it's beautiful, but this album is kind of forgettable. Not really forgettable, but just, yeah, you know what I'm saying. I'm rambling. But yeah, number 20, Rapture of the Deep. Number 19, The Book of Taliesyn. I've never heard anybody actually say this title, so I don't know how it's pronounced. I'm sure someone will correct me. This came out in 1968. This is their second album, the second of 3 for the Mark I lineup that had, from the beginning, Blackmore, Lord, and Pace. We had Nick Simper on bass, and then Rod Evans on vocals. And I think the major sort of weakness of this band is one, the lead singer sounds like a late 60s psych rock band lead singer. I don't think there's anything remarkable about his voice. It's definitely not hard rock. It definitely has a, it sounds like the late 60s. A lot of the music sounds like the late 60s. Has a very psych rock feel, a little early prog thrown in there, but none of it is like so good that like if you were to take the psych rock era or the early prog era, I don't think Deep Purple would be represented in that. I don't think it's the best of the era. So it's some good stuff. There are some good tracks on the three albums. I think this is the weakest of the three. Just sounds a little more dated or just a little less interesting than the other ones. There are a lot of covers on the first two albums. And these, I think, are some of the more interesting moments. So again, I can't rank it that much higher if they're just thriving because of their covers. But there's a cover of Neil Diamond's Kentucky Woman. Huge Neil Diamond fan. Probably the first album I ever really loved in my life when I was like 3 and 4. Was Hot August Night. My grandmother used to listen to it all the time. So big Neil Diamond fan. Love Kentucky Woman. I enjoy just hearing this song. And then there's a pretty long, like 10-minute cover of River Deep Mountain High. That's pretty interesting. And then there's an instrumental called Wring That Neck, which is kind of good. They do a Beatles cover of We Can Work It Out, which I don't really care for. So this album's pretty spotty, pretty hit and miss. But there were some really bright moments, some fun moments. It's not a bad listen. It's just definitely, it's just kind of good 60s psych rock with flashes of what would be Deep Purple brilliance just kind of popping up every so often, but limited by their lead singer. I think that would be the case for both the first album and the third album, one of those will appear on this list very shortly. Number 18, Shades of Deep Purple. It's the album I was just talking about that would appear on this list shortly. Their first album, their debut album, again, the Mark I lineup, again, limited by the vocalist, again, sounding kind of like a late 60s psych rock album. A whole bunch of covers on this one. Again, the covers are pretty interesting, but again, I think the strength of this album is the covers. It opens up with a pretty solid, pretty interesting instrumental and The Address, which the band would cover. The Steve Morse era has covered a couple songs from these early eras on their albums, and on the most recent studio album that's not covers, the Whoosh, there is an updated version of And the Address. But then you get a whole bunch of covers. The other things that aren't covers, One More Rainy Day, which I don't really care for. Mandrake Root, I can't say I'm a big fan of. Love Help Me, I don't really care for. But the covers, I think, are the standouts. Hush, I think we all know Hush, kind of a big hit from them. There's a cover of a blues song called I'm So Glad that has like an instrumental prelude in front of it that they wrote to kind of segue in it. That instrumental like prelude is pretty interesting. The cover is kind of okay. A cover of the Beatles' Help, which is kind of slowed down and given a whole different vibe. But it's the melody of the song Help, which I think ultimately makes this an interesting song, and just reminds you of like what a genius songwriter Lennon and McCartney were. So it's an interesting cover, but again, it's just a cover. And then there's a cover of Hey Joe, which is a really interesting, almost bolero-esque vibe to it, really kind of hard-hitting and aggressive. But again, it's a cover, so I have to penalize them for that because that's the mood I'm in. But it's a solid B album. Again, this is not a bad album. It's a good listen. It's just there are 17 better albums. But yeah, number 18, Shades of Deep Purple, their debut album. Number 17, Whoosh. This came out in 2020. To be honest, this is by far, other than the most recent covers album, the album I've listened to the least out of all Deep Purple albums. I can say when this came out, I listened to it a couple times. I wasn't immediately blown away by it. I've kind of gone back to it every so often, and I like it a little more every time. But I do think it is more similar to Rapture of the Deep than it is the other albums from the Morse era that would follow. This is the 7th album of the Steve Morse era. their most recent studio album, the fifth album of the Don Airey era. It definitely has really good songs. It's a fun album, but again, I don't think there's that one standout track that like is a great track. It's like an S tier or like a high A tier track. It's all just really good hard rock. It's got fun energy. The songs are a little bit shorter than you normally would have, so you don't have as many sort of extended like where you drop into that serious groove in the middle of a song, or you like do a little like prog interlude where it's, you know, slightly prog-ish and get a couple solos. You don't get as much of that on this album as you do the other Steve Morse era stuff. There is a little bit of cheese on here. There is a song, Drop the Weapon or Drop Your Weapon, Drop the Weapon, where it's just very like, drop the weapon. It's just got, there's a little bit of Ian Gillan cheese on this. But I love Gillan's vocals. I love his lyrics. I'm assuming he writes the lyrics. I write. But anyways, yeah, it's just a really, really solid album that gets better every time I've listened to it, but I honestly have not spent as much time with this as I have with the other ones. But yeah, a solid, solid album. Like the fact that this is 2020 and they've been doing it now for 50 plus years to still put out material this solid, pretty impressive. But again, I don't think there's a singular track that is like stands out from the rest. Maybe there is. Let me know in the comments if there is, so when I go back and check this album out, I can find that track. But it's just a really, really solid B tier, Deep Purple album. A little bit shorter songs, but still hard rocking as always. Yeah. All right. Number 17, Whoosh. Number 16, Deep Purple, their third album, the final album of the Mark I lineup. I think in this album we finally get a really, really healthy serving of Ritchie Blackmore on guitar and John Lord on organ. Ian Pace, as always, is ridiculous. The bass playing is also solid. The main weakness of this band continues to be its lead singer, which more than anything just kind of dates the band as still being part of the late 60s. This came out in 1969, if I'm not mistaken, right? Yeah, 69. So it kind of still sounds of the era, but I do think you get more of like, you know, the specialness that is Lord and Blackmore. Plus there is a run of songs in sort of the middle 2/3 of the album that is just fantastic. Starts off with two kind of weak tracks that I think are dated and sound a little like the psych, you know, average, if not good, psych rock material of late 60s. Then you get this run of tracks that is just amazing. You get a Donovan cover, Leilana, that works. You get a short little instrumental. You get the song called The Painter, in which like Blackmore is just all over the place. And then that goes into, what is the next one? A little thing called Why Didn't Rosemary? And then that goes into Bird Has Flown. And that run of songs right there is just fantastic. It's just more hard rock than I think the first two albums. Still the best, maybe their best version of what they could bring psych rock. The musicians are just kind of showing off their chops in a way that they didn't quite as heavily indulge in before. The last track is a long 11-minute, 12-minute kind of overindulgent mess, but that middle block of songs like completely redeems this album. And definitely, like, I think I read somewhere that after this album didn't prove to be successful, like they got, like Lord and Blackmore got financial backing to like continue the band or to like find people to be in the band just because like they were so good. And like this album truly shows off, their powers, you know, the potential that they had. And I may be misremembering that story with another band, possibly. I don't know. But anyways, yeah, great album. Really solid high B album. Maybe a low B plus. Again, a little bit dated sounding, but just the potential is starting to be realized in that middle chunk of songs. And it's a nice little run. So anyways, yeah, number 16, Deep Purple. Number 15, Purpendicular. This is the first of the Steve Morse era albums. So it's the Mark II lineup. You have Gillan, Glover, Pace, and Lord, but now you have Steve Morse on guitar. This is we're talking solid B plus range. Maybe one or two more standout tracks, and we easily get into A minus. But this is an amazing effort. If it has weaknesses, Steve Morse is not fully flexing his like muscles at this point, but he's flexing them nonetheless, and he's bringing definitely a different sort of guitar energy than Blackmore ever brought. He's definitely more of a shredder. He's definitely more of a like he's got those like technical skills that he shows off with that took me a while to come around to, but since I've come around to them, this album has gotten better and better over the years. Some standout tracks, the weird, oddly funky opener, Ted the Mechanic. The second song, Loosen My Strings, has this beautiful vocal melody that Gillan delivers. Sometimes I feel like Screaming is just Steve Morse at his, I think it's sort of a clinic in what Steve Morse does best, and like mixing his like just ridiculously fast shredding with these long drawn out melodic lines, and how he sort of balances those two, and like how all of his like shredding licks lead up to something that's more like uplifting and soaring, it seems like. Yeah. Some other good songs. Rose's Cantina has a really funky groove. Some Katie Lyde type Steely Dan vibes in the vocals. There's just a lot of different flavors on this album. You do get more of a proggy ballad in The Aviator that I don't really like. I think it did work better live. I think Morse played the acoustic parts on like an electric guitar live, and I think it's better live if I'm not mistaken, but it's a whole other video. So there's a couple songs that I think are weaker. I think Morse is definitely bringing, as we will see over other albums, an acoustic edge that Blackmore never brought, and a little more of a traditional flirting with a different style of traditional English music, than Blackmore's. I think we have more of a Jethro Tull flavor that seeps in sometimes. But for the most part, just a fantastic album. Yeah, just really good. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, what else did I put in my notes? I think that's about it. But yeah, it's a really strong album. And again, it took me a while to kind of come around to what Steve Morse is bringing to Deep Purple, but you still have Ian Gillan on vocals. So right there, that sound makes it identifiable as Deep Purple. And then you have that ridiculous, amazing rhythm section of Pace and Glover, who in so many instances, whether or not you like, and this is true with almost the entire Steve Morse catalog, more so than like I think earlier years, is sometimes the actual songs themselves are not as memorable or not as hooky or not as melodic as maybe previous stuff was, but at some point in every song it seems like they drop into a groove and they just ride this groove hard, and it's just like funky. It's hunky is what I'm going to call it. It's hard rock, but it's funky. It's hunky, and nobody lays down the hunky grooves better than Deep Purple. And I think that's one of the defining features of the Steve Morse era, is no matter what you think about sort of the song itself, the verse, the chorus, the melody, all that stuff, at some point they're going to shift gears into that hunky groove. And I think that's you're seeing evidence of what makes this album work. Plus, there's some really, really good songs. Yeah, so this is a really, really good debut album. I think you feel like the positive energy that this band has working with Morse. And yeah, it's a good sounding album, some great energy, some great songs. Yeah, what number was this? Number 15, Purpendicular. Number 14, Now What? This came out in 2013. This is the fifth of the Steve Morse era albums, the third of the Don Airey Mark 8 lineup, right? Yes. Right? Yeah, okay. This is a really good album. Again, B plus, high B plus. There's a lot of chances that they take on this. They kind of diversify the landscape pretty well. You get kind of a slower acoustic or opener. You get some more like symphonic kind of atmospheric stuff in the middle. You got a couple jams that sound a lot like Kansas to me. You have The Uncommon Man, which has like this really like dramatic fanfare sort of meat to the song that starts off with this sort of like spacey instrumental opening that sounds at times like Baroness's the opening track to the Red album, Rays on Pinion, kind of sounds like that, and then that morphs into like a Steve Winwood While You See a Chance, and then that morphs into like a Neil Diamond Crunchy Granola Sweet before this like fanfare comes in. All these really neat flavors in that. Some really good standout songs on here. Weirdestin has a kind of weird keyboard solo in the middle. Hell to Pay has a phenomenal chorus. There'll be hell to pay. Out of Hand has this really nice build to this really nice sort of jam at the end. What else? Yeah, some really good grooves throughout the entire album. Blood from a Stone is a really good song. The closing Vincent Price has sort of a hard rock kind of gothy energy about it. But yeah, it's a really solid album with a handful of really solid tracks. I think a couple of their attempts, I don't think the opening, A Simple Song, works as well as maybe they think it does. I don't think Uncommon Man is as good of a song as they think it is. I think those like attempts to be a lot different don't quite work out as well as the more straightforward hard rock stuff on this album works. But yeah, but the straightforward hard rock stuff on this album works incredibly well. And while I'm not a big Kansas fan, I definitely think there are some Kansas proggy flavors sprinkled throughout here, more so than on like earlier albums. But yeah, anyways, just another really, really solid Steve Morse era Deep Purple album. Number 14, Now What? And finally, the last album in the B tier before the sun finally takes over my shot right here. Number 13, A Band On. Abandon. The second album of the Steve Morse album, the last album with John Lord, the second album of the Steve Morse era, the last album with John Lord. And this is definitely just is an album that hits a lot harder than the first one. Steve Morse is shreddy more. The grooves seem a little bit funkier. It's definitely a little bit heavier. Again, there are some standout tracks as always. Seventh Heaven is phenomenal. Watching the Sky is phenomenal. She Was is really nice, slowly building like more solo. They do a kind of a reamped cover of Bloodsucker off In Rock. So yeah, it's just an all-around really good, hard-hitting, great B plus album. Again, we touched down with some of the acoustic vibes now. That's entering into the scene more often than it did in the Blackmore era. But, and again, not my favorite aspect of what Steve Morse brings to the band, to be perfectly honest with you. But it does sort of like diversify the landscape a little more. But again, this is just a lot like Purpendicular, just a really solid album, a little bit heavier, a little bit funkier, a little bit more shredding, a little bit more confidence. I think Morse a little more confidence in what he's bringing to the table. So yeah, the last of the B tier albums, number 13, A Band On. And that's it for Deep Purple B tier albums. We made it all the way to number 13. We threw 13 out of 21. Sun's about to completely take over and melt me. So gonna wrap this up. But yeah, all those albums are good, man. Those are solid albums. At worst, they're just like good but not great. But none of them are anywhere near bad. And I think Deep Purple has been like remarkably consistent. And I could understand why. I think really it comes down to whether or not you like the melody of that particular song or that solo. But I think if you had these completely ranked in verse order as me, or even like put some of them higher, and then I would buy any argument because they're all so good, and it really just comes down to like perfect personal preference. Steve Morse brings a guitar energy that took me a long time to come around to. The sort of acoustic energy is not what I want out of my Deep Purple. I don't mind when Ian Gillan gets super cheesy. I'm always okay with that, hence why Bananas is not yet on this list. But yeah, just really, really good stuff. And I can understand if you had completely different opinions about these albums because they're all really good, and I can see how someone could like them more. So let me know why I'm wrong, what you think is better, what you think is worst. Point out my mistakes. I think that's how this entire machine works. Or don't, and be cool. I don't know, whatever. I'm done. Thanks. The sun's about to burn me, so I'm out of here. See you next time for the Deep Purple A tier albums.